Welcome to the Proactive Security Podcast with Mike Hodges and Brine Hamilton. This podcast is dedicated to discussing violence prevention in healthcare. We want to inform, equip, and empower healthcare security leaders to prevent violence before it happens. And now, here's your hosts, Mike and Brine.
Hey everybody, I'm Mike.
And I'm Brine.
And today we're talking about continuous improvement in workplace violence programming.
Happy New Year, and thank you for joining us on today, January the 15th.
Yeah, 2021, man. I am so excited that we've finally gotten past 2020.
Yeah, 2020 was, for me personally, it was a great year in a lot of ways, but overall, it was tough. I will say I've had two previous employers who were working on strategic planning, and I did want to use that 2020 vision. I tried to use that twice, and twice I was told no for various reasons. Once was because it was just too far out for the strategic plan. And you know what? I'm really happy that they didn't let me do that, because there'd be two documents right now that would make me look very silly right now, because they'd be grossly inaccurate for the 2020 vision.
Oh, the 2020 vision. You know what I'm going to say? I'm going to say 2020 was so last year. We need to move on.
Sounds good. All right. So that being said, let's jump into continuous improvement and the whole process of developing a continuous improvement program. So I guess when we look at this, Mike, one of the things that's always important, and this is a kind of a recurring theme, is training and education. As far as training and education, where would you go with that? What do you think is a good foundation for training, education, and engagement, even in terms of a good continuous improvement process?
Yeah, so I think that's a great place to start. And when you look at workplace violence programming as a whole, any program that I've been a part of specifically, we've always started with employee training and employee engagement as kind of the two cornerstones to our foundation for the program's development. So you think about that in a couple of different contexts. One, your training lays the foundation for success or failure in any situation, whether you're looking at the way you train your security forces, the way you train your clinical staff, any training you provide on any level is going to lay the foundation for success, or it's going to lay the foundation for failure. And so you've got to invest in training. And so from a holistic standpoint, when you're looking at workplace violence programming, employee training has to be the foundation, and how you invest in that training is going to be pivotal. But I think in some ways, employee training eclipses the concept of employee engagement in a workplace violence program. And so you can't lose sight of engagement and just focus on training. It really has to be an in tandem process. And when I talk about engagement, what I mean is how you engage and get feedback and connection with your employees over and above what you do in a training environment. So you lay the foundation by giving them the education they need to succeed, but then you also continue that process of engagement by equipping them with the information they need given the operational environment they're in. We talk about that a little bit in one of the last episodes, where we talked about operational engagement and operational integration, where we really look at the concepts of trying to integrate ourselves, our concepts for workplace violence prevention, into providing care for patients and equipping ourselves with the knowledge about the events that are going on, and who presents a threat and who doesn't present a threat, and where the threats are, and how we can be more equipped with the knowledge to prevent violence as we enter into an environment. And so I think, that engagement piece is just as critical as the training piece. And both of those, working hand in hand, lay the foundation for a continuous improvement process.
Awesome. Now, as far as training, I know I have some of my personal favorites, training that I've participated in myself, especially when I was working frontline, training that I actually led. Do you have any specific preferences? And, feel free to mention names. You don't have to, but what do you think makes up a good training program for workplace violence prevention?
So there are a lot of programs out there that are great. And I think certainly you could look at the Crisis Prevention Institute and their nonviolent crisis intervention model. You can look at Vestalar and some of the work that they've done in crisis intervention training. And I think all of those have excellent aspects to their programs. What I think is important is that you as an organization Your organization, Brian, is going to be very different from my organization, just given the environment in which we exist, the services we provide from a clinical perspective, the populations we serve. All of those things play a role, right? And so I think you have to take stock. Just buying a training off the shelf and putting it into play is not the band-aid for all ills. You've got to take stock of what your environment needs are. Look at your organization, conduct your risk assessments, look at your vulnerabilities, look at your operational reality. And given that information, find the right training platform that's going to work specifically for you. And that may not be something that you pull off of a shelf somewhere and purchase from an organization. Maybe it's partnering with an organization that can provide you some specificity to your operational environment within the context of their platform. Or it may mean you need to develop something from the ground up for yourself. In any case, I think you have to start by looking at your operational environment first, understanding the realities in your facility, and then building or purchasing education that's going to fit that most effectively, no matter what organization that comes from or whether you build it internally. But when you look at some of the key things that are important, I think the word de-escalation gets thrown around way too much. I think we've taken away some of its power and authority because we've overused it. But de-escalation skills are critical, right? We need to be able to, in workplace violence prevention training, teach effective de-escalation. And that starts with understanding the realities of workplace violence in a healthcare environment, that understanding the root causes associated with violence in a healthcare environment, understanding the role of empathy in building relationships. One of the things that I think gets so lost as we look at skill building classes is we forget some of the conceptual information that helps us understand why we need those skills. And one of the key things that I think we lose conceptually is that all de-escalation begins with relationship building. We have to be able to build relationships with people. And we are uniquely privileged in healthcare to be able to enter into people's lives on their worst day and provide aid and comfort. And if we are failing to engage people empathetically and to work to build relationships effectively, then we're never going to have the kind of trust that allows us to de-escalate effectively. So that has to be a critical component of your education program. From there, you need to be able to study kind of a full escalation pattern, what it looks like from the emotional foundations of what will become escalating behavior or actual acting out to the culmination of the physical acting out. And then also, what are the key responses that we expect from our staff all along that pathway? And then from there, what are the key tools in our organization that you as an employee can draw from to help you mitigate that violence? And I think all of those things are really critical to building an effective violence prevention education program. And then I think also too, because physical acting out and workplace violence is so prevalent in healthcare, and we've talked about all the stats, but we have a podcast dedicated to it because it's a real deal. It's a huge epidemic in the healthcare environment. But because violent assaults are so prevalent in healthcare, we have to at some point teach practical self-defense. We have to equip our nurses and our patient care techs to disengage from assaultive behavior effectively and get themselves to safety. If we're not giving those skills, I think then we're failing to equip our frontline workers effectively, because that's going to be a reality of their job.
Excellent. And one of the things I actually want to get your thoughts about is verbal judo. What are your thoughts on verbal judo? Have you ever used it before at any of your programs? I know that you've recently done a lot of training with some new staff that have joined your program. Is that any part of it at all?
Yeah. So I love verbal judo is great. And I think the training in and of itself and the ability to verbally spar is one of those soft skills that we don't pay enough attention to. It's the same as not understanding the actual need for relationship building and empathy. The ability to verbally spar is a critical skill, right? And one of the things that I think is a lost art in some cases when it comes to de-escalation training is the ability to effectively redirect. We talk about talking with people, but we don't teach how to effectively redirect. What does it mean to redirect? What does it mean to verbally set limits? And so I think there's some significant opportunities utilizing verbal judo in the context of Thompson's book, but also, being able to teach practical skills or practical methods for redirection. So what does redirection mean? And then how do we leverage that effectively in conversation with someone who is on a path of escalation? I think that's a phenomenal skill set to teach.
Excellent. I think that segues well to the next point. Obviously, the training is very important. And then the second part of that, once the training has been developed and has been delivered, is making sure that employees have the correct tools to support violence prevention in the workplace. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think we talked about in one of our first episodes why proactive, right? Why proactive versus reactive, and I think one of the ways we address a proactive stance in violence prevention is by developing tools necessary to be proactive, giving our employees the outlets to pursue proactive postures. And so, when we talk about our employee training and engagement, we talk about engaging with the employees effectively by equipping them with information. Well, that's a proactive tool in and of itself. So teaching them in our education platforms where they go to find information about threatening patients, whether that's a system we've set up within our electronic medical record that flags previously violent patients, or whether that's a threat assessment process that we utilize in association with our security forces, whether that's a manual process where we just keep track and we put flags on doors or whatever that might look like, teaching them those tools and then expecting them to respond to those tools. Another aspect of that is the communication flow, right? So when we have daily safety huddles on units or on med-surg units, or for organizations as a whole, my hospital that I work at has a safety huddle every morning at 10 a.m. And you've got nurse managers and nursing directors and myself from public safety and other ancillary department leaders there, all talking about the safety incidents that have happened within the last 24 hours. Well, one of my key responsibilities there is to communicate about, hey, today public safety is tracking 15 patients across the organization. 3 of them are low level threats and they're in these locations, and 4 of them are medium level threats and they're in these locations, and so on. And so we've got this opportunity there, which is a reporting tool, where we're leveraging that reporting tool to open the pathway for communication, so that nurse manager on unit B can raise her hand and say, hey, I didn't hear you mention this patient that we've been dealing with, can you check on that patient? Or information can be exchanged in that way. So I think all of those things play into that engagement thought process, but you build those engagement opportunities through the training that you do as well. So you have to teach those tools, and those tools allow you to take on that proactive posture, and all of that feeds into how your employees are going to respond and ultimately report workplace violence incidents in the workplace day to day. Right. So the training you do, like I said earlier, the training you do is going to set the pathway towards success, or it's going to set the pathway toward failure. And so you teach the engagement opportunities and the tools associated with violence prevention in that training, and set the tone for employer response and
Excellent. And I'm glad you shared that, because I think every or most, anyways, organizations have some variation of the safety huddle. So that's a really good way to communicate, where you're focusing those efforts to prevent workplace violence. So I'm glad you shared that. I think a lot of people will be able to benefit from that tidbit right there, if they take nothing else away from our conversation today.
Well, I'll tell you, that was an eye-opening opportunity for me. And I early on in my career, shied away from the safety huddle. Like, oh, this is that other thing that I have to do every day that I don't want to do because it takes up time. And I'm sure that nobody who listens to this podcast has ever thought about a safety huddle in that way. But that was definitely me, where it was like, oh man, I don't want to do this thing again. And then I started taking an active part in reporting some of this information, I found that it had tremendous cultural benefits, even over and above the actual legitimate benefits of the communication exchange. And I remember I had 2 kind of key moments after I started doing active reporting on the threats and the patients, the high-risk patients that we were tracking on any given day. two moments. One happened within a week of me reporting regularly in safety huddle. One of the nursing directors came up to me and said, I am just so excited to know that you guys are tracking people on a regular basis and taking an active stance in how you keep us safe. And that was huge for me. That was a light bulb moment to say, hey, whoa, they didn't realize we were even doing this, which means we have failed. I have failed in communicating that effectively in the past, and this has now made this environment safer for her, and I'm sure not just her but others as well, just in having that knowledge. And then the other kind of eye-opening moment was happened maybe 2 or 3 weeks into reporting, where I finished my report, and to that moment it had just been me saying, hey, here's what I got 10 people here, and I got whatever it was. And I remember a nurse manager kind of raised her hand and said, hey, can you check on the patient in 3215? I don't remember the actual room number now, but she asked me to check. She's like, hey, I don't think you guys are tracking them, but I think you should. Well, suddenly that was more than just a hey, can you check on this? That was an acknowledgement that I believe, as a clinical leader, that you, security leader, can provide value in helping to keep my staff safe as a result of this challenging patient that we're dealing with. And we went, we checked, we talked, we had a great time. We and engaged in the process of working together towards finding some solutions. But that's fed so many further conversations down the road. But both of those kind of represented this cultural shift in taking that information, and now it became an exchange, not just me spouting stuff off in rote fashion, but having an open conversation about violence prevention with the clinical leadership and myself. And that is further, filtered down to our frontline leadership. I don't make those reports anymore as the public safety director. My frontline supervisors do, my shift leaders do, because I want them to have those conversations with the clinical leadership. And I want the clinical leadership to look at them as someone who provides value in problem solving around potentially violent patients. And so they have those conversations in safety huddle. And I stand there and am just in awe at how much they facilitate violence prevention as clinically integrated partners, our security forces and our clinical team members.
Excellent. Now, one thing I want to touch on with the training piece as well, because like I mentioned earlier, you spent a lot of time recently just training a lot of new staff or staff who have come on to join the in-house program. Now, in terms of that, what type of training in relation to the rounding and just checking in on these patients, what kind of training initially do you provide to your frontline security officers?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think if I could do everything I wanted to do in a perfect world, man, I would put my frontline security officers through a 3 to 4 week, basic training course before I ever cut them loose in the real world and let them go be an officer. But that's not what we're capable of right now. What we're doing right now is a week-long program where we bring those new officers in day one with new employee orientation. We issue uniforms and equipment, and we go through standards of conduct, and we do some of that kind of basic information on day one. And then in day two, we start hitting them hard and heavy with basic skills, starting with escalating behavior recognition and response, which is our violence prevention program, education program, but modified for the public safety officer. So we start with a full indoctrination into escalating behavior, the root causes, the key aspects of it within a healthcare environment, what it looks like to build relationships with people who are escalating, who are having a terrible day, because that's who we deal with in healthcare, and all the skills associated with de-escalation. And then we roll that into an understanding of pre-attack posturing and things like that. So key things to look for in individuals who are about to attack someone, who are about to transition from being angry or defiant or aggressive to being actually assaultive. And then we roll that into use of force training, and we build scenarios into that. We talk about team control and de-escalation and things like that, all the way up through day 2 and 3, where we go into less lethal weapons usage. So we do our taser certifications, we do our baton certifications, handcuff certifications, and all that. And then we culminate all of that in critical incident response and threat assessments. We really dive into patrolling basics and proactive patrolling, which is what we primary tactic we utilize, where we target our security forces patrolling patterns on our identification of high risk patients and high risk vulnerabilities. So we say, hey, when I report in safety huddle that we're tracking 15 patients and I give all those room numbers out, well, what that means is our frontline officers who are out there patrolling are going to be stopping in and checking on those patients on a regular basis throughout the day, throughout their shift. And as they're doing that, they're going to be, asking key questions and connecting through that engagement process with the clinical staff to say, hey, how is Mr. Smith in room 4212? Is he still doing okay? I know we conducted a threat assessment with you yesterday, and this is what we determined based on that. How's his behavior been today? Have our mitigation measures been effective? They're going to have those conversations. And so we start teaching that proactive patrolling process in that first week. And then we teach that threat assessment process. We have a tool called the Security Threat Assessment Team, which is led by our security team members, where they, along with the bedside nurse, can perform a threat assessment on the spot and identify a threat level and start the process of identifying mitigation measures to mitigate that threat right there at the bedside without having, they don't need the director with them. They don't need a manager with them. They don't need the charge nurse. Anybody. Those two staff members are empowered to do that through the training we've provided them, and then can take those measures forward to have more, proactive mitigation in place to prevent potential violence from that subject. So we go through all of that in week one and, culminate that with a broader understanding of our standard operating procedures and things like that. So we really pour into them in that first 5 days. And then they move from there into on the job training, where we partner them with more experienced and senior officers, and they do kind of a field training officer program where they really start to learn everything that we gave them in that first week. They start to apply that in the field with somebody who's done it before. And then those opportunities that we have in training in that first week, we repeat them. At a minimum, we repeat them annually, if not more often, to really make sure that we're refreshing those skills as often as possible.
And the thing that kind of stands out for me in all of that is the way that you've explained the training piece, and the officers working with clinical staff as well as the safety huddles. All of that really, and I don't know if you did this by design, probably, but you really have a good opportunity for collaboration there. So both from the management standpoint and from the front line and clinical standpoint. Was that like always the overarching thought when you kind of put these programs together?
Oh yeah, I always knew exactly what I wanted to do from day one. No, no, I think by this point, Brian, you figured out I fly by the seat of my pants more than anything else. So, but no, really, in all honest truth, what we discovered, we started taking a more holistic look at our violence prevention program about 5 years into really starting our efforts in earnest. And as we looked 5 years in back on what we'd accomplished in the last 5 years, we kind of found a program emerged out of that. We said, wow, that actually helps with this and this helps with that. And that really works well together. And the way we codified that was we started with that employee training and engagement thought process as kind of a one piece of a pie that feeds how our employees respond and report, right? So we teach them what we need them to do. We engage them on a regular basis with information critical to violence prevention. And then we see how that affects their response in the actual field. So when something does happen, how do they respond? And then how do they report on that? And then all of that reporting based on the response in real time to violent incidents feeds how we collaboratively manage the program. And so we pulled together, we talked about key leaders that are needed to be engaged in an effective workplace violence program. Well, we pull those folks together in a management oversight committee to take a look at all the reporting coming out of how our employees respond to workplace violence incidents. And so through that collaborative management oversight, we can review the metrics that we see, the data that we see coming out of reporting. We can look at the root causes. We can do that analysis as a collaborative management team. And then through that analysis, we can look for, barriers, for trends, for root causes that we can address organizationally, whether that's, from a policy standpoint or from a training standpoint or from a procedure standpoint. How do we address those things collectively as an organization? Then we translate that management oversight into action. And our kind of key area in translating that management oversight into action is we tweak our training and engagement processes. So we take that action and we tweak our employee training and engagement. So now we're back to the beginning with how we're training and engaging. And then we see how those changes in training and engagement feed how our employees respond and report. And then we monitor that through that collaborative management oversight as we see that data coming out of how our employees respond and report. And then we take that data and we analyze it, and we look at the trends, and we look at the barriers, and we look at the root causes, and we translate that into organizational action. So we're continuously feeding how we train and engage our employees so that modifies how they respond and report, so that we can monitor the data coming out of that to see if we need to make any additional adjustments to how we train and engage our employees, and so on. It becomes a very cyclical process, but it's that continuous improvement model that helps us fine tune our program in almost real time. I mean, you look, our workplace violence oversight committee meets once a quarter. And so every quarter we have the opportunity to adjust the training and engagement processes we have for our staff. And when you think big picture organizationally, being able to make adjustments every quarter to fine tune your program is almost real time adaptability as an organization. That's true organizational agility in the way that we respond to violence in our environment. And so it's that continuous process improvement that really helps us propel the program to greater and greater efficacy over longer periods of time. So employee and training and engagement, feeding how our employees respond and report, our employees' response and report, feeding information into that collective management oversight, which feeds into our organizational action and how we change, tweak, update, and improve our employee training and engagement. It's that constant wheel or cycle of improvement that we've put into place.
Perfect. Now I'm going to ask you probably the most broad question that I have to date, because you mentioned data so much there in that answer. What role does data play in terms of process improvement, or even just the predictive patterns for how you deploy your team?
Yeah. So data has been one of the most interesting, and yeah, you definitely made that broad. But data has been one of the most interesting opportunities that I've found in violence prevention in healthcare. So I've been doing this for about 10 years now. And in the course of the last 10 years, we see tremendous data in the industry about the amount of violence in healthcare. But nobody is tracking that information in the same way. We're basing the majority of that information off of what we see go to OSHA or what we see go to organizations like the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And we see those organizations collecting a solid standard of data. But when you look organization to organization, no two hospitals track workplace violence in the same way, if they track it at all. And so there's tremendous opportunity there. So one of the things that we had to do early on was set a standard for violence reporting and pull those data sets together that we thought were going to make us most effective in tracking and trending workplace violence issues in our facility. And so we looked at two primary data sets. So, obviously actual assaults. So any and all actual assaults, which we can subcategorize and stratify in different ways. But that number in totality tells a big story. And so we looked at total assaults as one key data set. And then the other was we looked at workplace violence indicator events, or at least that's what we call it, workplace violence indicator events. And so that was an amalgam of different incident reporting processes where we looked at security incident reporting from our officers on issues like disorderly conduct that didn't end in an assault, or threats and harassments, or damage to property, or several different subcategorizations of security incident reporting that demonstrate the potential for violence in the environment, if not the actual assaultive behavior itself. And so we looked at those two data sets as kind of our primary indicators for violence. And so we've been able to carve those up in different ways as we wanted to learn more about different aspects of violence within our organization. But those have been the two constants as we looked across the last several years of having this program in place is what are our actual assaults and what are our workplace violence indicator events and how do those track and trend? And then we subcategorize from there as we want to dive deeper. The key is data is critical. I mean, your question is how important is data in continuous improvement? And the answer is it's critical. You cannot have any kind of continuous improvement if you're not tracking the data from your project, right? Whatever that is. And so if you're not tracking data in some meaningful way, then you're not going to have any continuous improvement because you have no way to know if you improved or not. I mean, in all honesty, it's all anecdotal without the data. But the key is for any organization out there who's trying to do this is to identify how they're tracking and trending workplace violence related information. Now, look to see if that's accurate enough for them to tell anything from it, and then either improve it or not and stick with it, because you've got to have consistency in your data and your reporting if you're going to be able to measure effectively in any direction. So for most organizations out there that are trying to get their arms wrapped around workplace violence, if nothing else, they just need to pick some metrics to stick with and start looking at those on a regular basis and in an effective way.
Excellent. Now that covers everything I had. Was there anything else that you wanted to bring up, Mike?
No, man. I get to where I can talk about this stuff ad nauseum, which is probably why we got a podcast. Because I love having opportunities to discuss. But I think this is kind of one of the key aspects of violence prevention programming that I think nobody really looks at organizationally, and that's a lot of people say, man, I've put this great education program in place. That's my workplace violence prevention program. Well, that's awesome. You need a good workplace violence education program, but that's not a whole program. Or, hey, we did all these things to give our employees great tools for response to workplace violence. Well, that's awesome, but that's not a whole program. Or, hey, we got a committee and they're looking at information on workplace. Well, that's awesome, but it's not a whole program. You've got to be able to put all these parts together. I mean, all the pieces make up the picture for a full and holistic program. And those pieces being able to fit together to give you that continuous process improvement is it's amazing what you can do as an organization if you can put that together in a meaningful way and start feeding kind of this self-perpetuating process of continuous improvement into your violence prevention efforts. It's awesome stuff.
Awesome. That's a great way to summarize it, Mike. And as we wrap up, just want to invite everybody to join us again in February, where we're going to do a deeper dive into the key elements of an effective workplace violence prevention training program, as well as the do's and don'ts of de-escalation. Anything else to add to that, Mike?
No, man, just excited to be here in 2021. It's a beautiful view in January. I remember the view in January of 2020, so I hope that we don't see a similar downtrend in 2021, but I have great faith in the solid outlook for this year.
Great. I'm gonna really start focusing on my 2021 vision. It's slightly better than 2020, so we'll go with that.
I'm with you. 2 thumbs up.
All right. Until next time, everyone, stay safe and stay proactive.